months before his assassination on April 4, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a sermon entitled The Drum Major, which was an adaptation of a homily, The Drum Major Instinct, by Dr. J. Wallace Hamilton, a well-known liberal white Methodist minister. A drum major, or field commander, is the leader of a marching band, usually positioned at the head of the band or troops. The drum major is responsible for providing commands to the ensemble, leading them while marching and directing them what to play, when to play, and what time to keep. I like the imagery of a drum major. Being out front, leading the full band with the various sections playing in unison, punctuating the rhythm of the march, instilling courage in soldiers and leading them into battle. Both Dr. King and Reverend Hamilton tell the biblical story of two disciples of Jesus, James and John, who had beseeched him to award them the most prominent seats in heaven, that is, one on his right and the other on his left. At the core of their request was the desire for them to be promoted, lifted above all the other disciples, to have preeminence, to be recognized as special. Usually, there's nothing wrong with someone wanting to be first, but when the drum major feels that they actually deserve to be out front simply because of who they are, not necessarily because of their talent or contributions, and when they think that they are more important than the rest of the band, that's the point where the drum major ideology can become dangerous. Somehow in the disciples' minds, they felt that they deserved the promotion above their brothers. Needless to say, the other disciples were livid. Dr. King, in his sermon, warns that such ideology can lead to exclusivism. I would also add to that such ills as tribalism, sexism, xenophobia, and homophobia, to name a few. King directly links this mentality to what was happening in the nation at that time, as he calls attention to the tragic race prejudice. He says, quote, "Do you know that a lot of the race problem grow out of the drum major instinct, a need that some people have to feel superior and to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first," end quote. I would assert that this is also where ideologies such as manifest destiny and American exceptionalism stem from. The drum major instinct, or ideology, is driven primarily by the human ego. It doesn't matter if one has the expertise or the qualities required to be in a preferred position. The ego tells them that they deserve it, perhaps because of some external characteristic, such as the color of their skin or how big their bank account. Dr. King went on speaking of the hopes of the disenfranchised and the need for personal reflection and interpersonal responsibility, as well as the promise of America, which then was embroiled in racial conflict. It still seems the struggle hasn't changed all that much. What we have endured, particularly in recent years, is not the dream of America that many of us believe in, but too often and for too long has been the reality of America. While much of the turmoil does not reflect the nation's stated highest ideals, it certainly represents a repeating historical pattern. As we struggle for racial and economic justice, we must view this struggle in its historical context in order to be able to resist strategically and to build power to fight back. My reflection today is an attempt to address where we are and who we must be to fully embody the beloved community that Dr. King envisioned. As we all witnessed the outrage mixed with disbelief from within our own hearts and from across the globe at the recent storming of the U.S. Capitol, some politicians and dignitaries, including the President-elect Joe Biden, passionately proclaimed that this behavior was un-American and that it is not who we are. And yet, this is hardly an anomaly in the history of this nation. What's going on, and especially what occurred at the nation's capital, is something that stems from a long history of white organized backlash to the perceived advances of people of color and other marginalized groups. More and more theorists are coming to the conclusion that every point of seemingly achieved progress particularly around African American communities, is followed by an immediate backlash. Consider what historians call the first Reconstruction period, marked by the removal of federal troops from the South after the Civil War. Newly freed black men were suddenly able to vote and win elected office. In fact, in 1868, 33 black men were elected to the Georgia State Legislature. In September of that same year, white members of the Georgia legislature expelled all the black members, claiming that the new state constitution didn't allow for blacks to hold office. Such instances helped to birth the KKK and other domestic terrorists, who, through campaigns of intimidation and violence directed mostly at black Americans and the whites who supported them, became vehicles for the Southern white resistance to the Reconstruction era policies that sought political and economic equality for black Americans and for poor whites. On November 10, 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, at that time the largest city in the state, where African Americans constituted more than half of the inhabitants, with many of them holding political offices, a well-organized group of white supremacists staged a coup in the city, terrorizing its black citizens, killing dozens of them, and running many others out of town. Those who remained lived in fear for decades afterwards. Over 100 years later, the black community there still hasn't recovered from the violent coup and the subsequent oppression and subjugation. Our history is full of similar examples of this. Cincinnati, Detroit, Little Rock, Atlanta, Tulsa, Rosewood, New Orleans, and New York City, to name a few. Racial animus through social, political, and economic oppression subjugated people of color with lasting and devastating results. For nearly a century, the entire white population was deputized to monitor, control, and suppress black life and movement. Terror, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, the erecting of Confederate monuments, and redlining, voting restrictions, and segregation kept black people as second-class citizens. And many of these racist systems continue today. But the persistent struggle for equality brought what is described as the second Reconstruction period, culminating with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which integrated commerce, transportation, private business, public and higher education, and granted new political access. And yet again, as part of the new Southern strategy, there was a brutal pushback that included more lynchings, bombings, as well as numerous other atrocities, including the assassinations of a president, his brother, as well as several prominent civil rights leaders. Our current socio-political climate is now being referred to as the third Reconstruction period. Over the last 12 years, with the advent of the first black president, LGBTQ rights, marriage equality, DACA, the national push for inclusion and inclusive language, the Affordable Care Act, and the pulling down of Confederate monuments have brought us to another point in our history when the current backlash is likely to become as brutal as the last one. Because with each reconstructive period, there is a deconstructive counter response. The push to delegitimize a whole swath of black voters in an attempt to overturn an election, and the storming of the Capitol, as many have surmised, is maybe just the beginning of the turmoil that we as a nation would have to endure again. During this Reconstruction period, President Donald Trump became the embodiment of the drum major instinct. It is very possible the reason why Trump is so loved by his followers is because he became the symbol of deconstruction, and for some of the white resistance and pushback. As we all know, he has tried to deconstruct and undo everything that the previous administration had enacted, even if it didn't make sense, like dismantling the pandemic team right before a pandemic, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Pact, the Iran nuclear treaty, and so many others. And he did much of this at times seemingly out of pure spite. He gave people the right and approval to express their biases and prejudices. Whatever was truth for Donald Trump, in essence, became the truth for many of his followers. People tethered themselves to the worst side of the drum major ideology to the point of believing a lie. A poisonous lie, wrote one senior staffer, Jason Schmid, in his resignation letter. A lie that the election was illegitimate and should be overturned inspired so-called patriots to share common cause with white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and conspiracy theorists to attack the seat of the American government. End quote. It didn't go unnoticed the huge disparity between the law enforcement's treatment of and response to the mostly white demonstrators and insurgents in DC and that of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations earlier. According to polls, across the entire population, 71% of American adults opposed the storming of the Capitol building. But among Republicans, nearly half, 43%, supported it. 45% opposed it, and 12% didn't know what to think about it. Likewise, 56% of Republicans believe that Donald Trump's election court losses were due to bias against him and not the insufficient evidence of election fraud. In terms of race breakdowns for the 2020 presidential election itself, Louis DeCipio, political science professor at the University of California, Irvine, stated that nationally Trump was estimated to have won about 57% of white votes, with huge state-to-state variations linked to factors such as education and age, and that African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans voted strongly for Biden. In the aftermath, while facing a potential reckoning, many politicians started to disassociate and distance themselves from the outgoing administration. For instance, Oklahoma Senator James Lankford recently issued an apology to his African American constituents in light of the new epiphany that he apparently experienced, which brought him to the realization that his initial intent to object to the Electoral College vote count and the certification of Joe Biden as president in reality may have signified an attempt to disenfranchise Black voters and to delegitimize their votes. I cannot judge Senator Lankford's change of heart. The apology was truly due, and in the end, he withheld his objections. But I wish that some of his colleagues would experience a similar epiphany. Throughout history, Native and Indigenous people have witnessed and been victims of this kind of mob violence. Black people have experienced it, women, Asians, Latino, and LGBTQ people have faced it as well. In the previous 150 years, there wasn't any penalties for heinous crimes against marginalized communities. Thousands of lynchings, rapes, and murders took place with impunity, and the truth was often left out of the history books and county records. Countless individuals who perpetrated and participated in crimes against society and humanity went on to live lives free from punishment. Today, however, with the advent of cell phones, the internet, and social media, everyone gets to participate in the writing of history. There will be a record and a reckoning. We all get to know the truth. The Capitol insurgents' actions were also captured and documented for posterity. One can only imagine what will be their legacies, what their children and grandchildren will think of them in the years to come. When we consider the state of race relations in our nation, most of us are outraged, pained at heart, and disillusioned to see such open and blatant racism. And many of us are concerned with what comes next. The truth is, there have always been racists among us. They're part of the fabric of this country, its DNA. Sadly, this is who we are, and we will continue to experience racism in all aspects of American life. In government, they are our senators, presidents, mayors, and more. In civil leadership, there are pastors, teachers, bankers, police officers. We most likely interact with them daily. They're in our families. Some may be your fathers, mothers, cousins, children, or grandparents. And we progressives mustn't delude ourselves with the notion that there are no liberal racists even in our midst. This is who we are, but there is hope. To heal our nation, it will first take people coming to terms with our history and accepting the part their ancestors played in it, as well as what they themselves contribute to who we are as a nation. In an article for the Time magazine, author Carrie Wallace addresses the failure of the Christian church for its part in the breakdown of society. she admonished them to speak out directly against violence, racism, and white supremacy. She calls them to action instead of taking refuge in vague calls for prayer and healing. She asserts, quote, "There can be no healing without direct confrontation. You cannot cure cancer by pretending it is not there." The white American church can't pretend that the mob at the Capitol is not part of us. It is us. To have any hope of healing, we must accept that fact. We must admit that our own ignorance, our own apathy, our own discomfort with people who are different from us, our own desire to believe that we're better than everyone else, our own willingness to take things that are not ours and keep things we did not earn, our profound bent to lie about ourselves, our willingness to do violence to get what we want, our willingness to turn away when violence is done to others because it benefits us. We must forcefully, publicly name and repudiate these things. We must be honest about how long a history they have and how deep they go, and about how much work it will take to eradicate them, end quote. A few months before his drum major sermon, Dr. King released one of his last books entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" It does appear that we are presented with this same question today. The believers in beloved community must stay the course. When we look at the trajectory, 100 years between the first and second Reconstruction periods, and 50 or so years since the last one, we can see that the arc is still bending toward justice. If we continue our push forward toward America's truest values, despite any backlash and opposition, the next Reconstruction period could very well bring us ever closer to the vision of the beloved community that Dr. King shared. Sadly, in the days, weeks, months to come, I know that many of us expect more violence from the white nationalists and other radicalized groups directed primarily at marginalized communities. When we talk about chaos or community, I must point out that the founding of our nation came through a chaotic period. What we saw at the Capitol and what is yet to come will most likely be more chaos. Even last summer, Black Lives Matter, which some now call the Black Liberation Movement, used civil disobedience, chaos to energize people of all races, ethnicities, and walks of life to protest against police brutality. There are obviously competing visions for America. I believe that both visions truly want community, but it is clear from our polarization that each side has very different views of what that community should look like. Indeed, we are in an existential crisis, a battle for the soul of America. And not only that, but also for the future of the humanity and our planet. It is without doubt that in this struggle to determine who we will become, we must harness the strength of our truest values of goodwill and compassion. In this moment in time, I encourage each of us to revisit, reclaim, and refresh our visions and values. If there's ever been a time when we need to be clear about what we stand for, it is now. It is not likely that we're going to change other people's minds, but we can affect our own hearts. We can solidify our own vision of beloved community and the perseverance that it will take to realize it. Dr. King reminded us that Jesus didn't condemn the disciples for wanting to be first. He encouraged them to simply reorder their priorities. In essence, he implored them to acknowledge the feeling, recognize the desire to be first, but then to reorder it in a way that seeks first the qualities that are life-giving, such as being inclusive to the stranger, healing to the sick, merciful to the guilty, and loving and compassionate to the deplorable. Dr. King used Jesus' own life as an example of how the priority of love and compassion is the catalyst for greatness. And who is great among you, asked Jesus, but the one who is first a servant to all. In some of his final words, Dr. King intoned, "If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness." Chaos or beloved community. We get to choose. We all have our own drums, platforms, positions, influence. We must continue to touch, move, and inspire people to live and be their best selves. We are called to compassion and must allow ourselves to truly be the change. I'll conclude with a quote by author and activist Andrew Boyd. He writes, "Compassion hurts. When you feel connected to everything, you also feel responsible for everything, and you cannot turn away. Your destiny is bound with the destinies of others. You must either learn to carry the universe or be crushed by it. You must grow strong enough to love the world, yet empty enough to sit down at the same table with its worst horrors." May it be so. Amen.